Evelyn is out in the garden with a shovel because she can't afford to pay a man to fix one loose fence post. The cottage behind her leans a little, breathing cold air through the window seams, while her two grown children keep repeating the same heartless words. Sell it. Walk away. Let go of that worthless place. They think grief made her weak, and they believe a few more talks or a few more forms will force her to hand over the home she built with Calvin. But then the shovel strikes steel under the wet soil with a hard sound and a secret ring. All at once, only one question matters. What did Calvin hide beneath the home they tried to steal? Evelyn Hart lived in a cottage that asked something from her every single day. A window would stick whenever the weather turned damp, and a board near the hall gave a soft groan under her heel every time she stepped on it. The kitchen tap spat cold water first, always cold, even when she stood there waiting for the heat to arrive. She had learned the moods of the place the way you learn the aches in your own body. Not because it was easy, but because the house was hers. That morning, the kettle gave its thin old whistle while rain tapped against the pane over the sink. Evelyn stood in her faded grey cardigan, the one Calvin used to pull around her shoulders when the nights turned sharp, and counted the coins sitting beside the sugar tin. There was enough for tea and maybe bread if she stretched it, but there was nothing for a handyman, or the fence, or the roof stain spreading like a dark bruise over her bedroom ceiling. She drank her tea standing up and looked out at the back garden. The grass had gone wild at the edges, and the flower beds were more dirt than bloom now, but she still kept one small patch neat. That square of earth belonged to her in a way the rest of life no longer felt, and she remembered how Calvin knelt there every spring with mud on his cuffs and a quiet little smile. He always acted like the whole world made sense as long as seeds still pushed up through the dark soil. When Evelyn touched the garden gate, she still half expected to hear his voice behind her. That was the thing no one wanted to hear. It wasn't just a house to her. It was the place where her entire life had happened. Gregory came by just before noon, wearing a clean coat and the face he used when he wanted to sound kind. He stood in the kitchen with his hands in his pockets and looked around with a slow shake of his head. "Ma, this place is getting too much for you." Evelyn kept wiping the counter even though it was already clean. "It still stands." He gave a short laugh, acting like she had missed the point on purpose. "That's not what I mean. Between the damp, the stairs, and the yard, you shouldn't be doing all this alone." Now, if Gregory had looked at her while he said it, maybe the words would have landed softer. But his eyes kept drifting to the back window and the stretch of land behind the fence, staring at the dirt longer than he stared at his own mother. Evelyn saw that look, and she felt something cold move through her. Natalia came 2 days later with a bag of oranges and a voice full of pity. She walked from room to room like she was touring a place that had already been emptied out. She touched the peeling paint, pressed one finger to a crack in the tile, and stood in the doorway of Evelyn's room with a heavy sigh. "You can't keep up a place like this forever, Mom." Evelyn folded a towel and set it down. "I don't need forever. I need now." Natalia's mouth tightened just a little, and that was when the mask fell. "There are nice, smaller places," she said. "Warm ones, safe ones. This cottage is old and damp, and it's worth less than the dirt under it." That line stayed in the room long after she said it. Worth less than the dirt under it. You know how words can bruise, not because they're loud, but because they tell you what someone really thinks. They thought she was worth nothing, and they looked at the life she had built with Calvin and saw only junk or a burden. To them, she was just a delay between them and whatever they wanted next. But here's the thing. Evelyn was not confused. She was tired and grieving and cold some nights, but she was not blind. She saw Gregory's careful tone and heard Natalia's soft push, and beneath both of them, she heard the same hard pull. It wasn't worry or love driving them. It was hunger. So when they left and the cottage fell quiet again, Evelyn stood in the narrow hall with her hand on the wall where the paint had worn smooth over years of passing by. She closed her eyes and pictured Calvin hanging his cap by the door or setting down his old mug while bringing in the smell of rain and sawdust with him. They called the cottage worthless, but she called it home. Outside, beyond the wet glass, the garden waited. After that, the phone calls started coming more often. They weren't long talks, just little check-ins that didn't feel like checking in at all. Gregory would call to ask if she'd handled the tax bill yet, and then Natalia would ring to see if the roof was still leaking. One of them brought up the deed, while the other wondered if Calvin had left his paperwork in order. They made it sound like they were just helping her stay on top of things, but sitting there at her kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear, Evelyn felt a hollow chill. It was the strange sensation of listening to people plan for a life that only started once she was gone. That feeling didn't leave her. A week later, Gregory walked through the door carrying a neat blue folder full of printed forms. He set it down on the table right next to her teacup and tapped the top page with a steady finger. "I can take care of things for you, Ma, and that's all this really is." Evelyn didn't move to touch the folder. "What things?" "You know how it is. The bills, the property, just making sure nothing important slips through the cracks." He used that calm, easy voice again, the one that felt patient and practiced. It was the way a person talks to a child who might get upset if things move too fast. When Evelyn looked down, she saw the blank lines waiting for her signature, and her name sat right next to his under terms like temporary authority and transfer of access. It wasn't full control of her life just yet, but it was close enough that she could finally see the shape of the trap. "I didn't ask you for this," she said. Gregory leaned back into the chair that Calvin used to call his own. "I'm just trying to keep you from drowning in this place, Ma." There it was. It wasn't help, it was direction. It wasn't care, it was control. Evelyn slid the folder back across the table toward him. For one quick second, Gregory's jaw tightened, and that was when the mask slipped just a little further. He managed a smile after that, but it was a late, fixed smile that didn't reach his eyes. Natalia showed up the very next day, almost as if the two of them had planned the order of their attack. She didn't bring a bag of oranges this time, but she did bring a notepad. Evelyn stayed quiet and watched her daughter walk from room to room, scribbling things down as she went. "There's mold in the bathroom corner," Natalia noted. She made a sharp mark on the page. "And a loose tile by the stove." Another mark followed. "The pipes are old, the rooms are drafty, and the floor in here has a dip." She read off every floor like she was presenting a case in a courtroom, making it sound like the cottage had to defend its right to even stay standing. "The place needs some work," Evelyn admitted. "It needs a lot more than just work." Natalia turned around, and while she didn't look unkind on the surface, her eyes stripped the house bare. "Mom, nobody can live like this forever, and you're just clinging to a shell." A shell. Evelyn almost laughed at that because Natalia had no idea what actually lived inside those walls. She didn't know the deep scratch on the pantry door happened when Calvin dragged in lumber one winter after the shed lock froze shut. She didn't know the faded paint by the back step was covering the pencil lines where they had marked the children's height year after year. Her daughter didn't realize the house still held his life in it, in small, quiet pieces that were still very real. Thinking of the house brought Calvin back to her in a sudden rush. He used to have paint on his cuffs more often than a man who wasn't a painter should, and there was varnish there sometimes too. He ran odd errands that he never fully explained, and he always kept the key to the locked shed tucked away in his pocket. There were long drives to old estate sales, church bazaars, and dusty auctions in tiny towns Evelyn had never even thought to visit. When she asked what he'd found, he would just grin and call it bits and scraps. But she remembered the private spark that would light up in him. Back then, she just let it be. Now, she started to wonder. Memory has a way of changing its shape when the people around you start circling like vultures. The small betrayals only grew sharper as the days went by. Gregory showed up and measured the front windows without asking her permission, and Natalia stood in the back room asking which furniture Evelyn would keep if she moved somewhere smaller. It wasn't a question of if she would move, but which things she would take, as if the move had already happened in their minds. They treated her like her only job left was to sort through her junk and step aside. Then the tax notice arrived in the mail. Then the leak in the roof started to spread. Then the pantry shelves thinned out until there was nothing left but tea, half a bag of oats, and a single tin of soup she was saving for a colder day. Gregory saw the tax notice sitting on the table, and he pounced on it immediately. "This is exactly what I've been talking about," he said. "And one signature is all it takes for us to solve everything." He said us. He didn't say you. He didn't say help. He said solve. Evelyn felt a real sense of fear then, the kind that creeps in low and cold because money can do things that cruel words can't. Money has a way of cornering you, and it can make the wrong people look like they're right. She stayed quiet while Gregory talked, and he probably mistook that silence for her finally giving up. He was very wrong, because as soon as he left, Evelyn put on her boots, grabbed the old shovel from beside the back door, and went out into the garden to fix the one thing she could still handle with her own 2 hands. The ground was heavy and thick from days of constant rain, and every step Evelyn took pulled at her boots like the garden was trying to keep her there. She stood by the loose fence post with both hands gripped tight on the shovel handle and let out one long, slow breath. Her wrists were already hurting before she even started, and her back had been stiff since she woke up that morning. But pride is a powerful thing when the money runs out, so she pressed the blade into the mud and started working the earth loose. The cold air bit at her cheeks while the wet soil clung to the metal of the shovel. The fence leaned over just enough to feel like it was mocking her. She just kept digging. She wasn't fast, and she wasn't strong like she used to be, but she stayed steady. She took a scoop out, gave it a shake to clear the dirt, and pushed the blade back down again. It was the kind of hard work that makes your shoulders burn and your thoughts go quiet, and for a little while, that was exactly what she needed. There were no phone calls, no forms to sign, and no one telling her what was going to happen to her own home. There was only the sound of rain dripping off the bare branches and the dull scrape of steel cutting through the mud. Then the shovel hit something flat. It wasn't a stone. A stone gives you a dead thud, but this was sharp and clean, sending a hard ring up the handle that she felt right in her palms. Evelyn froze right where she was. For a second, it felt like the whole garden stopped moving with her, and even the drip of water from the eaves sounded louder than before. She pulled the shovel free and pushed it back down, much slower this time. The blade hit the same spot with a metallic clang, and it sounded hollow underneath, or at least close to it. This wasn't a piece of scrap metal tossed in the dirt or an old pipe. This was something broad, solid, and intentionally placed. Her heart started hammering against her ribs. Now, most people in her position might have dropped everything and gone back inside to call a son for help. But Gregory wouldn't have shown up as a son. He would have come as a man looking for an advantage. And if Natalia saw even a corner of hidden metal, the whole family would have heard the news before the sun went down. So Evelyn dropped to her knees in the mud and started using her bare hands. The dirt felt cold and slick under her fingernails, and old roots scratched at her skin as she cleared away the clumps of wet earth. Bit by bit, a rounded edge began to show itself. It was steel, dark with age but still firm and strong. She brushed more soil aside until she found a rim, and then she saw a hinge sunk low into the side. It was a hatch, a real metal hatch, tucked away beneath roots and flat stones, as if someone had wanted the garden to swallow it whole. She sat back on her heels and just stared at it. Calvin. The name came to her so fast it almost felt like someone had whispered it. Because who else would bury something like this in the yard? Who else would hide a secret well enough to sleep right above it for years without ever saying a word? Her mouth went completely dry, and she could smell the scent of iron now, even through the damp earth. It was the smell of old metal and air that had been shut away for a long time. Fear was the first thing she felt. Then came something else, a pull that felt deep and strange. Evelyn hooked the edge of the shovel under the lip and tried to pry it up, but it wouldn't budge. She set the tool aside, wiped her palms off on her skirt, and found a steel ring packed tight with mud in the center. It took both of her hands and every bit of strength left in her shoulders to pull. The seal fought her for a moment, and then, with one rough jerk, the hatch finally broke loose. A breath of stale, heavy air rose up from the darkness. She flinched back instinctively. The smell hit her next. Iron, dust, and something dry that had been closed away for decades. Beneath the hatch was a black opening that dropped straight down, and fixed to the side was a narrow metal ladder with rungs that disappeared into the shadows. There was no light down there, and no end that she could see, just total darkness. Evelyn stood there shaking, keeping one hand on the cold steel edge of the opening. Rain tapped against the leaves around her, while the mud soaked through the knees of her clothes. Her pulse was thudding in her throat. If she called Gregory now, this secret would stop being hers before she even had a chance to understand it. But if she just walked away and covered it back up, she knew she might never be able to sleep again. She looked back once at the cottage, toward the window over the sink where her life had been lived. Then she reached out, took hold of the ladder, and started climbing down into the dark, alone. The ladder shook under Evelyn's weight as she climbed down into the opening. It wasn't a violent shake, but it was enough to make her grip the rungs tighter until her fingers started to ache. With every step she took, the circle of light from the garden shrank, and the air began to change around her. This wasn't the crisp cold of an autumn afternoon, but a heavy, stagnant chill that had sat undisturbed in the dark for years. Dust caught in her throat and made her cough. She stopped halfway down to look back up at the sky, which now looked like a small gray coin framed by tangled roots and the wooden edge of the hatch. Part of her wanted to climb back out and bolt the door shut, pretending she had never found anything at all. But here is the thing about curiosity and desperation. You do not climb into a hole in the earth unless something much stronger than fear is pulling you forward. She kept going until her shoes finally hit a solid floor. The ground felt like concrete or flat stone, dry and hidden under a thick velvet coat of dust. Evelyn stood perfectly still at the bottom with one hand still on the ladder, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the gloom. The air smelled of iron and old paper, but it didn't smell like rot or neglect. This room had been planned and cared for, and it felt strange to find such order in a place hidden beneath the dirt. A thin line of daylight reached down from the hatch and revealed the shapes of sturdy shelves lining the far wall. As her vision cleared, she saw more shelves, then the heavy edges of stacked wooden crates. Rows of oilcloth bundles sat tied with neat cords, and long sealed tubes rested in brackets like tools in a workshop. Flat shapes leaned against the walls under canvas covers, all of them arranged too carefully to be considered junk or scrap. Every inch of the space told the same story, which was that Calvin had built this sanctuary for a very specific reason. Evelyn moved through the shadows and brushed her palm across the nearest shelf, leaving a trail in the dust. Her heart was still hammering against her ribs, but the initial terror was starting to give way to a sense of wonder. She reached for one of the wrapped frames and hesitated for a long moment, her hand trembling before she finally untied the string. Inside was a painting. It wasn't a massive or flashy piece, but a quiet scene of a woman standing near a window with light catching the curve of her cheek. Evelyn stared at the soft brushwork, and a familiar tightness gripped her chest as she remembered her husband. Calvin used to spend hours looking at art books, running his finger just above the pages without ever touching the ink while he talked about light as if it were a living thing. She had listened to him back then, of course, but she had never truly understood his passion until she held this canvas in her own hands. She set that frame aside and opened another, then another, uncovering a world she never knew existed. There were delicate sketches on yellowed paper, a small oil landscape of a valley, and a detailed study of a pair of hands. One frame held a signature she didn't recognize, but tucked beside it was a label in Calvin's neat, slanted handwriting. It listed the estate lot, noted that the surface had been cleaned, and gave instructions to keep the piece wrapped. Evelyn turned around in the dim light as the truth began to rise up around her piece by piece. This wasn't just a single hidden treasure or a lucky find, but a real, professional collection. Her knees felt weak, and she sat down on a crate, pressing her hand to her mouth to keep from crying out. Calvin, her quiet husband who always came home with mud on his boots and sawdust in his hair, had spent years building a secret kingdom under their garden. Then she spotted the tin box. It sat alone on a far shelf, a dull blue color under the dust, with her own name written across the lid in black ink. She reached it in 3 quick steps and nearly dropped the metal container while she fumbled with the latch. Inside lay a folded letter and several bundles of receipts tied with string, along with gallery papers and a list written so carefully it made her eyes sting. She opened the letter first. It began with the words, "My Evie," and that was all it took for the dam to break. Tears came hot and sudden because she hadn't heard him use that nickname in so long, and for one dizzy second, it felt like he was standing right there in the shadows. The letter was short, because Calvin always knew how to be plain when the truth mattered most. He explained that some of these works came from closed estates or private trades, while others were pieces he had restored himself after people threw them away. He wrote that he kept them hidden because greed has a way of ruining everything it touches. He had seen too much family betrayal in his life, watching good things get broken up and sold off by people who didn't care about history. "If I am gone first," he wrote, "this is for your shelter, not theirs." Evelyn read that specific line 3 times before she turned pale from the sheer weight of what he had done. Calvin had known what was coming long before the first bill arrived or the first relative started circling. He had looked past his own death and her grief to see the hungry hands that would eventually reach for this house, and he had built her a wall beneath the earth to keep her safe. It was a shield. She gathered the letter to her chest and looked around the room again, but the space didn't feel like a cold vault anymore. It was proof that the man everyone thought had left her with nothing had actually left her a way to save herself. But they didn't know the truth yet, and as Evelyn climbed back toward the daylight, she knew this secret could either save her life or destroy it if the wrong people found out. Evelyn closed the hatch and pulled the wet soil back over the edges, carefully replacing the flat stones until the entrance vanished. By the time she made it back into the kitchen, mud was streaked across her skirt, and her tea had gone cold on the counter. She locked the back door and then the front, standing in the silence of the hallway while she listened to the house breathe. She told no one about what she had found. She didn't call Gregory or Natalia, and she didn't even mention it to the neighbor who usually waved from across the hedge. Secrets can rot a person from the inside out, but some secrets are the only thing keeping a roof over your head. Evelyn knew the difference now, so she wiped the dirt off the tin box and hid the letter deep in an old bread bin that no one else ever touched. The next morning, she took one small sketch from the room below and wrapped it in a thick wool blanket. She slipped the receipts into her handbag and took the bus into town, her stomach twisting into knots during the entire ride. There was a woman Calvin had mentioned years ago after one of his mysterious trips, someone he described as honest and sharp. She wasn't a flashy dealer, but she knew estate papers the way a tailor knows fine cloth, and Evelyn still had her name on an old envelope. The office was located above a local bakery, and the air inside was warm with the smell of sugar and fresh bread. The woman who opened the door was plain and professional, offering a steady look instead of a practiced sales smile. When she asked if she was speaking to Evelyn Hart, Evelyn simply nodded and said she needed to know if her husband was a fool or a genius. That comment earned her a small, genuine smile. Inside the office, Evelyn unwrapped the sketch and laid out the handwritten copies of the receipts she had prepared. The woman worked in total silence at first, turning the frame over to check the backing and holding the paper up to the light. She didn't rush the process or put on a show, which was the greatest kindness she could have offered Evelyn in that moment. Finally, the woman looked up and confirmed that the piece was absolutely real. Evelyn couldn't even find the words to answer because the room suddenly felt very still and very small. The expert explained that the markings matched known private sale habits and the restoration work was incredibly skilled. If the rest of the collection was even half as good as these papers suggested, this wasn't just a pile of attic trash. It was a serious private holding that changed everything. The inheritance no one wanted was no longer a burden or a crumbling shell of a house. It was a miracle. It meant the roof could be fixed before the leaks got worse, and the heater could run all winter without her having to count coins for groceries. Most importantly, it gave her the right to stay in the home where Calvin had loved her. Evelyn sat back in her chair and let out a long, slow breath of relief. She didn't care about being rich or buying fancy things, but she cared about mended gutters and dry walls. She dreamed of a winter where she wouldn't wake up in the middle of the night, wondering if this was the month the bank would finally drive her out. But here is the thing about the world. The very moment that desperation leaves a room, greedy people can sense the change in the air. Gregory called her that evening, and his voice sounded far too bright and energetic to be natural. He told her she sounded different, and asked if she had spoken to anyone recently, skipping the small talk to probe for information. Evelyn gripped the phone and looked out at the dark garden where the rain was starting to fall again. She admitted she had gone into town for some air, but Gregory didn't believe her for a second. He laughed, but the sound was flat and cold as he told her not to make things harder than they needed to be. After the call ended, the cottage felt smaller and more vulnerable than before. The danger had changed because Gregory realized he was losing his grip on the situation. Before this, they thought she was just a broke widow they could manage, but now the ground was shifting under their feet. Evelyn stood at the sink and let cold water run over her hands while she looked at her reflection in the dark glass. Money was no longer her greatest weakness, which meant the real fight for her home was only just beginning. Gregory came back 2 days later without calling first, and that alone told Evelyn everything she needed to know about his intentions. He knocked once before letting himself in while she was still crossing the hall, carrying that blue folder tucked under his arm like a weapon. This time he didn't bother with the patient smile he usually wore, and his damp coat shoulders suggested he'd been rushing through the rain. His jaw looked set tight, locked in a way that signaled he wasn't here to ask for favors anymore. "Ma, we need to settle this now," he said. Evelyn closed the door behind him and leaned against it, her voice dropping to a low simmer. "Do we?" "Yes, we do." He walked straight to the kitchen table like he still had some right to the head of the house, spreading his papers out right beside the bread bin. Evelyn had to keep her face perfectly still when his hand came within inches of Calvin's hidden letter, but she didn't move a muscle. Gregory tapped the top sheet of his document with a rhythmic, annoying thud that echoed in the quiet room. "I've spoken to someone, and these delays are just foolish because if anything happens to you, this whole situation gets messy fast." "To you, not for you." Evelyn stayed by the sink, keeping the physical distance between them as wide as possible. "What someone?" "A legal office." "What legal office, Gregory?" He exhaled through his nose with a sharp huff of irritation, making no effort to hide how much her questions were bothering him. "That doesn't matter right now, because what actually matters is getting this signed before the entire place becomes a bigger problem than it already is." A bigger problem. This was the home where he learned to walk, the kitchen where she stitched his torn school shirts, and the back garden where Calvin taught him how to hold a rake. Now, in his eyes, it was just a problem to be solved. You can hear how cold that sounds when a person decides to kill a memory with words just to make the betrayal feel a little easier. Before Evelyn could find her voice to answer him, Natalia came in through the back door without knocking. She stepped out of the rain and shook the water from her sleeves, looking from Gregory to the papers like she was joining a meeting she'd been invited to. The softness was gone from her face, replaced by a clean sort of impatience that left no room for her usual sad sighs or gentle daughter voice. "Good," she said. "You're here." Evelyn stared at her daughter, feeling the chill from the open door. "In my own house, I am usually here." Natalia ignored the remark entirely as she pulled out a chair and sat down with a heavy thud. "Mom, we really need to be practical about this because the back and forth has gone on long enough for everyone involved." Gregory pushed the folder toward Evelyn again, his eyes tracking her every movement. Just sign the temporary authority so we can get a proper assessment done, and then we can maybe list the property before the winter weather hits. There it was, out in the open at last. Not a plan to move her, and certainly not a plan to help her stay.
They wanted to list the property.
Natalia folded her hands on the table, her knuckles white against the wood.
And before you start, yes, we have talked about what happens later, because we had to consider beneficiary rights and making sure there is fairness for everyone.
Evelyn's eyes settled on her daughter's face, searching for a flicker of the girl she used to be.
Later.
Natalia did not flinch.
Yes.
Gregory looked annoyed that his sister had said the words out loud, but he didn't try to deny what they were planning. That was the exact moment the mask fell all the way off, not with a shout or a wild threat, but with that flat, ugly calm people use when they're done pretending to care. They had already sat down and discussed how to divide her home while she was still standing in it, before she was even gone. A silence filled the kitchen so thick that Evelyn could hear the clock tick over the stove and the weak drip from the tap hitting the metal sink. Gregory leaned back in his chair and rubbed one hand over his mouth, looking everywhere but at his mother's eyes. "We're just trying to avoid a disaster," he muttered. Natalia nodded toward the dark hallway. "You can't manage this place anymore with the stairs and the repairs and the taxes. And if we have to involve people to prove that, we will." There was the real move, the one they'd been holding in reserve until they lost their patience. It wasn't about concern or safety. It was about using pressure to make her feel small and old. They wanted her to believe that strangers with clipboards could come into her kitchen and take away everything her own hands had held together for decades. For one brief second, that old, cold fear rose up in Evelyn's chest again. Then it passed. It passed because Calvin had left her more than just art and memories. He had left her proof of her own worth. He had given her a way to stand up straight when the people she loved tried to bend her. So she just let them keep talking. She listened while Gregory used words like sensible and necessary, and she listened while Natalia spoke about safety as if safety was just another word for surrender. While they spoke, Evelyn saw them as children for one painful little flash, remembering Gregory at 7 with a split lip, and Natalia asleep in the back seat after a school play. She had loved them through every fever and every fear, keeping their coats warm by the fire and scraping the mud from their shoes every single winter. And still, here they were. They were hollowed out by wanting things that didn't belong to them. That realization hurt more than the legal threats ever could, but pain can harden into something useful when the truth is finally plain enough to see. Evelyn lifted her chin and looked at both of them, not as a mother begging for a moment of peace, but as the rightful owner of the house they thought they could overrun. She decided right then that the next words out of her mouth would change the temperature of the room forever. She did not raise her voice when she spoke. That was the first thing that unsettled them because they were expecting her to cry or get angry. Evelyn crossed the kitchen to the table, pulled out the chair at the head, and sat down with a slow, deliberate grace. She reached for the bread bin and lifted the lid, pulling out Calvin's letter along with the copied records and the clean folder she'd brought back from town. Gregory's face changed the moment he saw the documents, and Natalia went perfectly still. "What is that?" Gregory asked, his voice losing its edge. Evelyn laid the papers out one by one, making sure they were as neat as church linen on a Sunday morning. "This is the reason you will both stop speaking to me like I'm halfway gone or unable to think for myself." Neither of them moved a muscle. She placed Calvin's letter right in the center of the table, followed by the receipts and the written advice from the woman who worked above the bakery. Evelyn did not rush the process because she wanted them to feel every second of the silence. The whole room had been bending under their pressure for weeks, but now the weight was shifting back onto them. "Your father," she said, "left property in this home that belongs entirely to me, and it does not belong to you." Gregory leaned in, his eyes darting across the pages. "What property are you talking about?" "The kind you don't get to touch." Natalia's mouth opened and shut like she was gasping for air. "Mom, if this is just some old box of junk you found in the attic..." "It isn't."
That answer landed hard, and Evelyn watched the transformation happen in real time. First came the shock, then the spark of greed, and finally the quick, ugly math happening behind both of their eyes. The mask was gone for good now, and Gregory reached out to grab the nearest paper, but Evelyn placed her hand firmly over it. No. Just that one word. No. You don't get to come into my kitchen to plan my death and divide my home, and you certainly don't put your hands on what your father hid to protect me from this exact kind of hunger. Gregory's face flushed a dark, angry red. Protect you from us? Is that what you think? Yes. The word cut through the air like a blade. Natalia pushed back from the table so hard her chair nearly tipped over. That's completely unfair to say. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a long, quiet moment. No, Natalia. Unfair is treating your mother like a burden while she's still standing at this stove, feeding herself every single day. Silence fell over the kitchen again. Outside, the wind moved through the bare hedge with a lonely whistle, while inside, the old clock kept ticking like it had heard every lie they'd ever told.
Evelyn slid the folder a little closer to them, but she kept it just out of their reach so they wouldn't be tempted to grab it.
The cottage stays exactly as it is, and the collection will go into proper care on my terms when I am ready. The deed stays clean, access is restricted, and no one enters this home to assess or sell anything unless I give the word. Gregory stood up too fast, making the chair legs scrape against the floor with a jarring screech. You're making a massive mistake here. Evelyn met his stare without blinking. No, I almost did, but I'm not making it now. That stopped him cold. Maybe some part of both of them finally saw the truth of the situation. She wasn't cornered anymore, and she wasn't some poor widow counting coins while she waited for a rescue that was actually a trap. Calvin had seen the storm coming years ago, but she was the one standing in the middle of it now, and she wasn't going anywhere. They saw trash they could sell. She saw the home she had built. Beneath the rot they focused on, a miracle was waiting to be revealed. When Gregory and Natalia finally left, they didn't slam the door or make a scene. They walked out quiet, because they realized there was nothing left for them to grab that day. Evelyn stood in the hall with Calvin's letter pressed against her chest, feeling the cottage settle around her like an old friend. She would mend the roof and fix the fence herself, and if her children ever decided to come back, they would come back with respect, or they wouldn't come back at all. As the sun went down, Evelyn stood in the garden with damp earth on her shoes and the hatch sealed tight under the roots. She felt the weight of her grief, but she also felt a new kind of strength. When your own family sees you as nothing but a burden, they usually miss the truth buried right under their feet. If you want more stories where the truth was hidden and the cast aside finally take their lives back, subscribe to see justice served in the next story.